Today we're going to begin talking about personality. And by personality, psychologists really refer to the relatively stable and enduring pattern of thoughts, feelings, and actions. In other words, our behavior tends to be relatively similar. There are some consistencies in our behavior across different settings. And the explanation for why we see that similarity in people, that's what we're really referring to when we talk about personality. And of course, just like with any other topic, there are different theories that attempt to explain where does our personality develop from and how can we conceptualize personality. And we're going to start off with the historically probably best known explanation of personality. This is the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic theory that was proposed by Sigmund Freud. And according to Freud's theory, there are four key concepts. First, there are different levels of consciousness, which we'll talk about. There's a certain structure to everyone's personality. There are certain defense mechanisms that we use to protect ourselves against some of those conflicts that occur within the different levels of consciousness. And he believed that there are psychosexual stages of development that each individual passes through, and each of those has its own influence on personality. So Freud identified three basic levels of consciousness, and it's often used, the iceberg analogy is often used to explain these different levels of consciousness. So Freud thought that the largest part of our levels of consciousness was the unconscious, and this was Freud's term for thoughts or motives that lie beyond a person's normal awareness, yet still exert great influence. Now, of course, to some degree, we're constantly being influenced by unconscious processes, as we talked about before, in terms of memory and types of processing. That most of what we do is under the control of automatic processing. It doesn't require conscious effort, and many of our behaviors are carried out through implicit memories, which also don't require consciousness. But that's not necessarily what Freud was referring to when he talked about his unconscious. He also said that there was a preconscious, and this was the term that he used to describe thoughts or motives that are just beneath the surface of awareness, but can be easily brought to mind. So these would be, the equivalent of things that are in your short-term memory, in your long-term memory that you are not thinking about right now, but you could very easily think about. For example, if you just got done eating breakfast, that's something that might be at your preconscious, something that you could readily recall, but you're not necessarily thinking about at the time. And then the conscious level is used to refer to thoughts or motives that a person is currently aware of or is currently remembering. Okay, so as you can see from the iceberg, the majority of what's going on in terms of these different levels of consciousness is driven largely by unconscious forces. So, as I said, Freud also had a conceptualization of the structure of personality, and the mental structures that he talked about include the id, ego, and superego. So the id he saw as a primitive, instinctive part of personality that works based on something called the pleasure principle. That is exactly what it sounds like, that the id, this mental structure within our mind, you can't think of it as a brain region per se, but rather just a part of our mind that attempts to seek immediate gratification for things. Okay, now the ego is the rational. It is irrational. The ego is the rational decision-making part of personality that operates according to what he called the reality principle. That is, although we would certainly like to seek immediate gratification many times, sometimes we are not able to. And so, according to this reality principle, we sometimes need to delay gratification of the id's impulse until a more appropriate time. Finally, there's the superego, which is a set of ethical rules for behavior that are developed primarily from parental and societal standards for morality. And this part of the mind, this structure, operates on something called the morality principle, where we feel guilty if any of the rules, according to these moral and ethical standards, are violated. Okay, so the id is largely unconscious. The ego and the superego tend to exert more of their influence at a preconscious level. The superego was also somewhat at the unconscious level, and the ego is more of what we're most conscious of at the time. Okay, so what Freud talked about in terms of defense mechanisms, he said that there are these conflicts going on between the id, ego, and superego. They're largely going on under the surface, right, at an unconscious level. And we need to protect ourselves from this conflict because, according to Freud's view, if we became aware of these struggles, these unconscious conflicts, we would experience a great deal of anxiety. So, defense mechanisms, he would say, are largely protecting us from the experience of anxiety if we were to become aware of what was going on. Okay, so it starts out, we have these unconscious conflicts that are capable of producing anxiety and or guilt, but we use defense mechanisms that are capable of decreasing our anxiety and guilt. And so some of these defense mechanisms you've probably heard of because they tend to be used to some degree in the public. So repression refers to the preventing of painful or unacceptable thoughts from entering into consciousness. Now, this is actually one of the more controversial defense mechanisms because there's been a lot of research into the question of whether we're capable of repressing memories, and more importantly, whether we're capable of repressing memories and then uncovering those repressed memories years after, for instance, a traumatic event has occurred. And that's something that we'll talk about a little bit later on. But I believe that we've spoken about this briefly. The evidence is actually not quite that good in terms of being able to recover memories that are repressed, or even really that repression of particularly painful memories is actually a possibility in the first place. Sublimation, on the other hand, is a redirection of socially unacceptable impulses into acceptable activities. Denial, refusing to accept an unpleasant reality, rationalization, creating a socially acceptable excuse to justify unacceptable behavior, intellectualization, ignoring the emotional aspects of a painful experience by focusing more on the abstract thoughts, words, or ideas that represent the experience. Projection is the transferring of unacceptable thoughts, motives, or impulses onto others. Reaction formation refers to not acknowledging unacceptable impulses and overemphasizing their opposite. Regression refers to reverting to immature ways of responding, and displacement refers to the redirecting of impulses from the original source toward a less threatening person or object. And it's interesting, we can see these defense mechanisms, most of them in our day-to-day lives, whether they are actually defense mechanisms in the sense that Freud had believed that they were being used, or the followers of Freud had believed they were being used. That's a different story. So even if we do see these defense mechanisms being used, they may not be used for the purpose of protecting us from anxiety of unconscious conflicts per se. Okay, so now Freud also had developed a theory of psychosexual stages of development. These are 5 developmental periods during which particular kinds of pleasures must be gratified if personality development is to proceed normally. So according to Freud, there are these strong biological urges within the id, because we talked about how the id operates on the pleasure principle. It's constantly seeking gratification, and so at each of these psychosexual stages, Freud thought that the focus of the id to derive pleasure was in a different area, and he believed more specifically that if a child's needs are not met, or if even they're overindulged at a particular psychosexual stage, then the child might become what he termed fixated, or a part of his or her personality will sort of remain stuck at that stage. So these stages are associated with different ages, and so if one were to get stuck in, say, the oral stage of psychosexual development, then that's the equivalent of saying that you're still acting in some ways in order to as potentially as an adult to try to satisfy those urges that were not met earlier. Furthermore, under stress, he said that individuals supposedly may return or regress to a stage at which their earlier needs were frustrated or potentially overly gratified. Okay, so during the oral stage, which is approximately birth to 18 months, the erogenous zone. Now, the erogenous zone, as I said, this refers to the area that Freud thought that the infant or the individual, because these are not all infant stages, it's the area that the individual is seeking gratification through stimulation. So, in this case, weaning from the breast or bottle becomes the key conflict, because the infant is, anybody who's ever seen an infant knows that they're constantly attempting to suck on things. One of the easiest ways to pacify an infant is to give them a pacifier. The anal stage lasts from approximately 18 to 3 years. Here, the erogenous zone is the anus, and the key developmental conflict or developmental task is toilet training. In the next psychosexual stage, this is one that Freud thought was particularly important, and this one is, again, particularly controversial. He called this the phallic stage. From 3 to 6 years, the erogenous zone becomes the genitals, and the key conflict becomes overcoming something that he called the Oedipus complex by identifying with the same-sex parent. So, what is this Oedipus complex? Well, according to Freud, unresolved sexual longing for the opposite sex parents can lead to, this occurs for both boys and girls in this theory, can lead to resentment and hostility toward the same sex parent. In other words, a little boy has what Freud termed a sexual longing for his mother, and therefore might be resentful toward his father, who is obviously with his mother. And Freud referred to this Oedipus complex, or attraction for boys to their mothers. He thought that young girls would develop an equivalent attraction to their fathers, and believed that girls might blame their mothers for a lack of a penis. And so Freud also believed that girls experience something called penis envy. Okay, these things sound a little bit silly, to be honest, to be talking about today, but they were, believed to be radical developments at the time. And this is not the first time that we've seen something like this. We're going to talk about, in terms of some, if we look at the treatment of the history of the treatment of mental illness, for instance. We believe that dunking people in cold water, or shocking them, or cutting out areas of their frontal lobes of their brain, we thought that these were all effective treatments for mental illness. So you kind of have to place Freud's thinking within the context in which he developed these theories. This is in the early 1900s, and so we need to be mindful of the cultural context in which these theories developed. But they, of course, remain very controversial to this day, and most people that subscribe to the psychoanalytic perspective do not believe in all the aspects of Freud's theories, and as we're going to see in a few minutes, neither did many of his contemporaries who sort of branched out from Freud and developed their own theories. So, okay, the fourth stage, called the latency stage, from 6 years to puberty, there was actually, in his theory, no erogenous zone, but the conflict involves interacting with same-sex peers. The genital stage, from puberty to adulthood, the erogenous zone is once again on the genitals, and the key conflict here is establishing intimate relationships with those of the opposite sex. So as I said, many of Freud's contemporaries did not agree with his emphasis on these unconscious sexual drives, and one of his contemporaries, Alfred Adler, was one of the first to sort of disagree with Freud. Instead of seeing behavior as motivated by unconscious forces, he believed that behavior is more purposeful and goal directed, and so he's often credited with developing something called individual psychology, where he stated that we're more motivated by our goals in life, especially goals of obtaining security and particularly overcoming feelings of inferiority. So again, this is something that a term that you've probably heard before, the inferiority complex. Well, to Adler, these refer to the feelings of inferiority that develop from early childhood experiences of helplessness and incompetence. And so our motivation comes from goals in life, particularly goals of obtaining security and overcoming these feelings of inferiority. Now, Carl Jung, he also branched off and believed that there was a different emphasis. He believed that that there's something called a personal unconscious, which is created from our individual experiences. But he also believed that there was what he termed a collective unconscious, which is identical in each person because it's inherited largely genetically. So this is a theory that is kind of similar to the idea behind evolution, except according to the theory of evolution, there's no mention of how unconscious anything from the unconscious is transmitted per se, but rather instincts are transferred, and so there might be a difference in terminology there. But the collective unconscious, like I said, it consists of primitive images and patterns of thought, feeling, and behavior that he referred to as archetypes. So, according to Jung, the collective unconscious is the ancestral memory of the human race, which supposedly explains the similarities that can be seen in various types of religion, art, symbolism, and dream imagery across symbols. Now, another neo-Freudian just refers to new Freudian, okay? And you might notice that there's a difference here between what is historically called psychoanalytic versus psychodynamic. Okay. Now, the difference between those two terms is that psychoanalytic traditionally has referred to Freud's theory. Okay, but as I said, there were a number of his contemporaries that didn't subscribe to his belief system quite as strongly as he did, and so they branched off. And those who branched off, and this includes the people who are the more modern types of theorists today, who believe in some of the things that Freud talked about, but don't subscribe to his entire theory. Okay, and those individuals are referred to both as neo-Freudians, new Freudians, or psychodynamic theorists. Karen Horney was another woman. She was another woman that branched off from Freud's beliefs. She believed that when a child's needs are not met by nurturing parents, the child may develop lasting feelings of helplessness and insecurity. And how people respond to this, she called basic anxiety, sets the stage for later adult psychological health. So she believed that adult personality was shaped by the child's relationship to the parents and not by fixation at some stage of psychosexual development. Again, these are largely individuals that disagreed with many of the aspects of Freud's theory, but the commonality seems to be that that early development plays a critical role in shaping future development, which I think most psychologists would agree to, whether they are psychodynamically or psychoanalytically oriented or not. I think that there's some research to support that is certainly true, but again, it's a question of whether it's specifically shaped by primarily the relationship to parents, or whether there are other factors that might be going on in childhood. So it's really where the emphasis is on in terms of what happens in childhood, where you start to see divergence among theorists that are either dynamic or non-dynamically oriented. Horney also emphasized women's positive traits and suggested that most of Freud's ideas about female personality reflected a male bias. For example, of course, the penis envy concept. Now, there are a number of criticisms of psychoanalytic theories. One of the biggest, of course, is that many of them lack inadequate empirical support. So remember that above everything else, psychology is a science, and psychologists need to follow the scientific method, and they need to use evidence, empirical evidence, that means based on observation, that what they are proposing has support. And many psychoanalytic concepts, such as the psychosexual stages, cannot be empirically tested. And anything that cannot be empirically tested is going to be very controversial and subject to challenge. Of course, there seems to be an overemphasis on sexuality, biology, and unconscious forces. Modern psychologists believe that Freud underestimated the role of learning and culture in shaping personality. And of course, many psychologists, particularly as I just mentioned, Karen Horney, reject Freud's theories as being derogatory toward women. The enduring influences are that defense mechanisms, we can see those, those do exist. Again, the question is more of, what is the purpose of the defense mechanisms rather than their existence. But Freud was very radical in terms of, at the time, nobody was really talking about the unconscious, but the unconscious really plays a major role in what we do. In fact, if we had to be conscious of everything that we were doing throughout the day, we wouldn't get very much done. Okay, it's the ability to do things unconsciously, that is, through the use of automatic processing and implicit memories, that allows us to really focus on more important tasks, or I shouldn't say more important, because breathing is obviously a very important task, yet it's not consciously regulated, but tasks that require conscious effort are able to be performed exactly because of the role that the unconscious plays. And also, Freud had some insights on how childhood experience, are going to be factors that shape one's development of personality, among other things, into adulthood. Okay, now we're going to talk about what are called trait theories. Now, by traits really refer to the relatively stable and consistent characteristics that can be used to describe someone. And there are a number of early trait theorists, Gordon Allport, Cattell, Eysenck. These early trait theorists really pioneered new ways of measuring and describing personality traits. So Freud's theory was largely developed on the basis of his experiences without doing any solid scientific work. But the trait theorists were using, at the time, radical statistical methods, in particular something called factor analysis, to try to identify what are the different characteristics or traits that make up personality. Now, the other thing to be aware of when it comes to traits and trait theories of personality is that traits are things that exist along a continuum. So you could either be high in a particular trait or low in a particular trait. But it's believed that these traits are characteristic of everyone, and it's just a question of to what degree do you express a particular trait. And the relative expression of and constellation of the different traits that you express is what's believed to determine what a particular person's personality is like. So this factor analysis, as I mentioned, is a statistical procedure for determining the most basic units or factors in a large array of data. Now, the example I usually use, factor analysis is a very complex statistical procedure, okay, and it's beyond the scope of an introductory psychology course to talk about this. But the way that I usually describe it is think about the exams that you usually take in a class, right? Exams usually cover various chapters or topics. For example, a test might be on chapters 1 through 5, right? So, and the test might have 50 questions on it. Now, let's say that it's broken down evenly, such that there are 10 questions from each chapter. Okay, if you look at the relationship between the different items on that test, the different test questions, you might find that some questions, for instance, questions 1 through 10, which represent material from chapter 1, are more closely related to one another than they are to the other questions on the exam, 11 through 50. Okay, 11 through 20, questions 11 through 20, on the other hand, might be more closely related to one another than they are to any of the other questions on the exam. Okay, and let's say that questions 11 through 20 represent chapter 2, questions 31 through 21 through 30 represent chapter 3, questions 31 through 40 represent chapter 4, and so what I'm saying is that these individual items within this 50 item test, some of them are more related to some than they are to others. Okay, and so if you analyze the relationship among all these different items, what you would most likely find, and this would be particularly the case if for instance, you knew chapter 1 very well, you didn't read chapter 2, but you studied very, very hard for chapter 3 and chapter 4, and you just glanced over chapter 5. So what you might expect to find is that you did well on the questions from chapter 1 and from the questions on chapters 3 and 4. You did not do well on the questions from chapter 2, and you did so-so on the questions from chapter 5. Okay, so the analysis of your performance would reflect the fact that we can group together these different questions on the basis of which chapter they came from. So in this case, this test would have 5 factors, and the factors would just be representations of the fact that a group of questions came from a particular chapter. Okay, now that's exactly how this 5-factor model of personality was developed. Researchers took a number of descriptive adjectives that could be used to describe someone's personality, and they found that some of them were more related to each other than they were to others. And so my description of the 5 factors that might be found on a test is exactly how these 5 personality traits were discovered as well. Okay, and this is actually the most dominant theory of how to understand personality currently. Okay, so these 5 traits are openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Okay, you can remember this using the acronym OCEAN, OCEAN, to remember openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And as I said, one of the strong points of the trait model is that everybody possesses these traits to some degree, and people can either score very high on these traits or very low on these traits. So low scorers on the openness trait tend to be down to earth, uncreative, conventional, and uncurious, whereas high scorers tend to be imaginative, creative, original, and curious. Okay, those who are low scorers on this factor called neuroticism tend to be calm, even-tempered, comfortable, and unemotional. But those who are high scorers on this trait would tend to be more worried, more temperamental, more self-conscious, and more emotional. So, the names of these traits are relatively self-explanatory, but neuroticism is probably one that you're less familiar with. That just generally refers to emotional stability. Okay. So there are some criticisms of the trait theories, of course. One is that they lack explanation. That is, they focus almost entirely on description, describing one's personality rather than explaining why people develop the particular way that they do. Now, that was not so much what trait theory developed for. Okay, in any science, we have to have a solid understanding of how to describe the things that we're seeing before we can really understand how they develop and why they develop the way that they do. The other major criticism has to do with stability versus change. It's still a little bit unclear which characteristics are more stable or are likely to change, but that's a relatively minor criticism in my opinion, because of the fact that some of those traits do appear to be more stable, and there is certainly longitudinal research. You'll remember that that's a term that we talked about in the context of developmental psychology. Longitudinal research has been conducted to look at the degree of stability and change over time in personality traits. Okay, now there are also humanistic theories of personality. We talked about humanistic theorists very early on. Humanistic theorists believe that personality and behavior depend largely on how we perceive and interpret the world, and there's a major assumption in humanism and humanistic theories, and that's that people are naturally good. Okay, we've also talked about the concept of self-actualization in the context of motivation. This refers to the inborn drive to develop all one's talents and capabilities. And there are two major theorists that we tend to think about when we think about humanism, and that's Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. Now, according to Rogers, the most important component of personality is the self. That is what a person comes to identify as the I or the me. Today, Rogerians, which is just the term that's used to describe those who subscribe to Rogers' theory, Rogerians, they use the term self-concept to refer to all the information and beliefs that you have regarding your own nature, your unique qualities, and your typical behaviors. So according to Rogers, we're going to talk about him in the context of psychological disorders and treatment, because he was actually more of a therapist, a psychotherapist. He developed his own form of psychotherapy. But it's important to talk about him in the context of personality, because he believes that the way that you conduct therapy is largely determined by your view of the individual and the individual's personality. So according to Rogers, mental health can be explained by the extent of congruence. That is, our self-concept is either going to be largely congruent with our experience, or it could be largely incongruent with our experience. If the way that we see ourselves is consistent with what we actually do, then there's considerable overlap, and that's what he would say is we're living a congruent life. On the other hand, if the way that we view ourselves is not consistent with what our experiences are, that is, what our behaviors are, how people treat us, what we're told, those sorts of things, he believed that this would result in an individual being poorly adjusted. So a term that Rogers used was unconditional positive regard. He believed that we should, in order to help people, because remember that humanists really above all else, they strive that humans are good, okay, and that we just need to help get the goodness out of them, because they may have had experiences that have made that difficult for the individual. And so Rogers believed that we should provide individuals with unconditional positive regard. Okay, that is love and acceptance with no contingencies attached to it. In other words, not saying I will love you and accept you if you do this, but not if you do that. Okay, that would be conditional positive regard. Unconditional positive regard is how you might feel about your children. That no matter what they do, you're always going to love them. Hopefully that's the case. Now, this he believed that this was very important for healthy and full development, but that the behaviors that individuals engage in and the value of the person are separate. That is, it's not as if people will not do bad things. They will, and it's not as if you should say that it's acceptable to harm other people. Okay, but harming other people would be the behavior, which, as I said, Rogers would say is separate from the individual. You wouldn't call the person a bad person. You would say that the person who is good engaged in a bad behavior, and you would treat that accordingly. Now, again, Maslow's hierarchy. We've already talked about this in the context of motivation, as I said. According to this hierarchy of needs, there's sort of a natural movement upward from physical needs to the highest level of self-actualization. But he also believed that sometimes we regress to a lower level, particularly under stressful conditions. For example, if there's a natural disaster, what's the first thing that we do when we know that there's a hurricane coming? Well, we go to the store and we stock up on food and water, right? So, we can regress, and we could potentially become fixated depending on the length of the stressor. Now, in terms of some of the criticisms of the humanistic theories, some people might say that it makes some somewhat naive assumptions. Critics suggest that the humanistic theories are unduly optimistic and overlook the negative aspects of human nature. For example, there are known bad things going on in the world, terrorism, wars, murders, those kinds of things, and it's not clear how the humanistic theories would explain the existence of those things. They also have relatively poor testability and inadequate evidence. So sort of like the psychoanalytic terms and concepts, this idea of unconditional positive regard and self-actualization, these are difficult to define operationally and therefore to test scientifically. And you'll recall, hopefully, that when I say define operationally, that means defining something based on how you're going to measure it. So how are you going to measure unconditional positive regard? How are you going to measure self-actualization? Those would be different things that are difficult to try to measure. And also, like the trait theories, another potential criticism is that they're merely describing personality rather than explaining it. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the social cognitive theories. As the name would imply, the social cognitive theories emphasize the influence of social interactions with the environment and cognition, that is, our thoughts, feelings, expectations, and values. So Albert Bandura is one of the primary architects of the social cognitive theory of personality. And according to Bandura, he said that he believed that if you have a strong sense of self-efficacy, you'll believe that you generally can succeed regardless of past failures and current obstacles. Your self-efficacy will in turn affect which challenges you choose to accept and the effort that you expend in reaching those goals. But that self-efficacy is usually specific to the situation. So he believed that self-efficacy is this learned belief that one is either capable of producing desired results if you have high self-efficacy, or the opposite if you have low, such as mastering new skills and achieving personal goals. And he also believed that there was a reciprocal determinism, such that cognitions, behaviors, and the environment interact to produce personality. And this term, reciprocal determinism, refers to the fact that not only does the person affect the environment, but the environment affects the person. Not only does the environment affect behavior, but behavior affects the environment. And so that's what this reciprocal determinism refers to is that these things all interact with one another in order to influence one's personality. So personality and behavior is, according to another social cognitive theorist, determined largely by expectations, that guide your behavior and influence the environment as well as reinforcement of values and outcomes. So, for example, playing the lottery would have high reinforcement value, right? The idea of winning millions of dollars would have a very positive outcome. However, you might expect that the likelihood of winning the lottery is very low, and so you wouldn't play the lottery. On the other hand, if you had higher expectations, but expected that something would have very low enforcement value, you might not, engage in that behavior as well. So it's really a combination of these two factors. Now, he also talked about the importance of locus of control. Locus of control could either be internal or external. An internal locus of control refers to the sense that we feel that our own effort exerts primary control on outcomes, as opposed to the external locus of control. Some people have more of an external than internal locus of control, which means that these individuals believe that the environment and external forces have primary control. So, for instance, we talked about this before. If you believe that you did well on a test because it was easy, that would be consistent with an individual having an external locus of control. Whereas if you felt like you did well on a test because of your own effort, that would be more characteristic of an individual with an internal locus of control. And having an internal locus of control is typically associated with having better outcomes in terms of higher achievement and better mental health as well. So, in terms of some strengths of the social cognitive theories, well, they emphasize the person-situation interaction, which is consistent more with a biopsychosocial model, and also it offers testable objective hypotheses, and the terms, unlike the more psychoanalytically derived theories, are more able to be operationally defined and therefore permit empirical testing. However, at the same time, it ignores the unconscious, which is believed to play a role in the formation of personality, and it also ignores to some degree environmental and emotional aspects of personality. Okay, now we're going to take a look at some of the biological theories, and of course the three main contributors in terms of our biology are going to be the brain, neurochemistry, and genetics. In recent years, there have been a number of research studies looking at how different personality traits, these are largely studies that look at personality from the trait perspective, looking at how patterns of brain activity correlate with various personality structures. So, for example, there's been some fMRI studies that have found certain areas to be associated with the trait of risk-taking. There have been studies looking at the differences in left and right hemispheric activity using EEG, and how that relates to the concept of extroversion. Although one of the problems here is that personality is a very complex construct, and so we're not likely to find that any one specific location in the brain is going to determine personality. Although, if we look at one of the most famous case studies in all of psychology is that of Phineas Gage, and Phineas Gage was the individual that had was working on a railroad and had a tamping rod blown through the top left side of his brain, survived the accident miraculously, because this was in the mid 1800s at the time, and it was really described that his personality had drastically changed. The frontal lobes play an important role in our personality, but in terms of you know being able to localize specific aspects of personality to specific brain regions, that's certainly um, gonna need a lot more time before that research starts to demonstrate any really good, reliable findings. In terms of neurochemistry, there's been some research looking at sensation seeking that's been linked to levels of an enzyme called monoamine oxidase, which regulates levels of monoamine neurotransmitters, of which dopamine is one. There's been research that shows that dopamine is correlated with novelty seeking and extroversion, and so this is also relatively new research in this area, and of course genetic studies. Behavioral geneticists have looked at the degree to which personality traits are similar among individuals of different relatedness, and as you might expect, given that genetics plays a large role in just about everything, that when we look at the degree of similarity in traits using that five-factor model of personality, it appears that genetic factors contribute to roughly about 40 to 50% of personality variability. So genetics are exerting a strong influence, and again, that's research that comes from looking at differences between monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins who are both raised apart and raised separately in comparison to parent offspring who are raised together separately or together, and so on. So personality is of course influenced by a number of factors, each of which, at this point it should be clear, all interact with one another. But if we were at this point, and this model is of course going to be subject to change, right? Because that's one of the characteristics of science, is that whatever we think right now is not necessarily what we're going to think 10 years from now, or even 5 years from now, depending on the particular area of research. But roughly at this point, the belief is that 40 to 50% is governed by genetic factors, 27% is determined by non-shared environmental factors, 7% by environmental factors, which essentially means that having a shared environment contributes to you having a more similar personality to someone else that shares that environment with you in comparison to someone who doesn't. And roughly 16 to 26% are largely due to unknown factors. So this is a model that is subject to change at any time, and we're really trying to fill in those unknown factors. Okay, so we've been talking quite a bit about personality and some of the different theories about personality, what personality is, but how do we actually assess personality? Well, generally there are different methods that are used to measure personality, or just really to obtain information, generally speaking. There are interviews, which could be either structured or unstructured, and a structured interview is just one in which the questions are pre-written out, and you ask them in a very specific order. You don't really deviate from those questions, and they're largely yes or no, but there is a person that's asking the questions and writing down the responses. And an unstructured interview is, as the name would imply, less structured, meaning that you have a set of questions that you have in mind that you might want to ask, but the interview itself is more governed by the individual that's being interviewed. The interviewee takes a larger role in determining how the interview is conducted. Then, of course, we also need to use observations in which we look for specific behaviors and interactions. And then there are what are called objective tests. Objective tests are typically standardized questionnaires, and two of the more common ones are the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the MMPI, which is one of the most widely used tests in all of psychology. It's actually more likely to be used in the field of clinical psychology than in personality research per se, because it is largely a diagnostic instrument. Okay, it's used to try to diagnose individuals with various mental disorders. But the Myers-Briggs type indicator is also a personality measure that assesses on different dimensions that are actually largely derived from Carl Jung's theory of personality. So there's introversion, extroversion, sensation seeking and intuition, thinking and feeling constructs, and judging and perceiving. Now on the MMPI-2, as I said, this is just the second version of the original MMPI, which was developed in the mid 1900s. It was revised in the late 1980s, and there's actually been a subsequent revision, which is now called the MMPI-2RF. But these are some of the scales that you would find on the MMPI-2. There are 10 clinical scales and 4 validity scales. The validity scales are used to help determine whether the person was believed to respond in a forthcoming manner. That is, sometimes individuals, when they're being assessed, might try to provide either a more or less favorable impression of themselves than may be warranted. Okay. Now, in addition to the objective techniques, there are also projective techniques. Okay, projective techniques are, which we've talked about these before, and also in the context of motivation. They use ambiguous stimuli, such as ink blots or drawings, which allow the test taker to project his or her unconscious onto the test material. That is, whatever story you develop about that picture on the left there, or whatever you see in that ink blot on the right, is a reflection of your unconscious, it's believed. Okay, the Rorschach ink blot test on the right is probably, again, one of those tests that most people have at least heard of before. Although, I will say that these projective tests are extremely controversial in the sense that there are some people that use them that believe that they are very valid and very reliable instruments for personality, but there's another group of researchers that believe that these tests should not be used and have very questionable reliability and validity. And I'll leave it at that for now, because again, the discussion of how valid these measures are is beyond the scope of this class. So interviews and observations, they can be time consuming and expensive. They can also be to some degree subjective. You want to try to minimize that by using, say, a structured as opposed to an unstructured interview. And they can also involve unnatural settings, depending on where the observations are occurring at least. The objective tests are subject to deliberate deception and social desirability. There are diagnostic difficulties that are going to be present anytime inventories are used because of potential problems like overlapping items that can make it difficult to pinpoint a diagnosis. Clients can have certainly several disorders. Scores may be within the normal range, and sometimes they can be elevated, but it can be difficult to say how elevated does something have to be exactly before it constitutes being problematic. And there's also the potential that there's cultural bias and that they may be used somewhat inappropriately, because these tests were largely developed based upon North American and Western European cultures and cultural values. As I said, the projective tests, these can be also time-consuming. Participants may be less likely to fake responses, although that's not necessarily going to be the case. And the idea is that it's difficult to fake what is going on unconsciously, but of course your conscious could influence the way that you perceive those as well, or again, you might attempt to portray yourself in a way that is not reflective of your true status. They're largely unstructured and may allow sensitive topics to come up. As I said, the reliability and validity is extremely controversial. But briefly, it is very important to know at least what reliability and validity are. Reliability is the measure of consistency and reproducibility of test scores when a test is re-administered. So if I were to give a test, say a Rorschach ink blot test, and you were to give a Rorschach ink blot test to the same individual, would we arrive at the same exact conclusions? That's a question of reliability. Or if I gave it to you today and then again, 6 months from now, would that produce the same test result? That's also a question of reliability. Validity is the ability of a test to measure what it's designed to measure. And again, it's beyond the scope of this course to go into a great deal about validity. But how do we know that we are actually measuring the unconscious when we're using these tests? And or not even with just projective tests, but that's a question that we need to ask about all tests that are used.